Welcome to Design Talks Now, hosted by Design Pavilion, held annually in the plazas of Times Square to help inform the general public on architecture, design, and urban planning. I'm Eileen Shaw, producer of Design Pavilion. My team and I longingly await the reopening of New York City to continue our mission of delight and education through design. We can't wait to gather again in public space, and for me especially in Times Square. There will be a return, but in a new way. We're reevaluating our use of urban space to safely convene and experience life together again. Today's talk, The Power of Public Space in a Digital Age, examines the rise of culture as a driving force in the built environment. First, we'll meet our panelists. Callie Verkamp, project lead at Wheeler Kearns Architecture, and Jesse Reiser, co-founder of RUR Architecture and a professor at Princeton University School of Architecture, and Eric Logan, principal at CLB Architects. Our moderator is David Sokol, a New York-based writer and editor specializing in architecture and design. David contributes to Architectural Record, Cultured, Dwell, and other publications, and his most recent book is titled Hudson Modern. Our panel will address the design strategies that will sustain and enhance public space and keep it relevant in urban environments made for people. So now, let's begin.
Hi, I'm Callie Verkamp, and I'm excited to be here. I'm a practicing architect based in Chicago. I've been working at Wheeler Kearns Architects for about 7 years. During this time, I've been able to explore my interest in public space through my work on the Chicago Children's Theater and more recently, the Momentary. Both of these projects involved the adaptive reuse of an abandoned institutional or industrial building into a revitalized community asset. The Momentary is a contemporary art space in Bentonville, Arkansas, that intends to upend everything expected from a museum experience. With an emphasis on the fluidity of contemporary art, the space facilitates overlaps between visual art, performing art, culinary experiences, and everyday life.
I'm Jesse Reiser, who, with my partner Nanako Umamoto, started Reiser and Umamoto RUR Architecture 25 years ago. But in fact, our collaboration came out of a family business started by my grandfather, Edward Klausner, a structural engineer and inventor. From the long perspective, RUR's dialogue with public space began with his design for the Hopi Indian Pavilion at the 1939 World's Fair in New York. As a young architect, my mother, Deborah Reiser, the third R in RUR, harnessed her father's engineering expertise beginning in the early 1950s in the office of Nemeny and Geller, who were disciples of Van Allen and Marcel Breuer, creating award-winning mid-century modern residences in the New York area. Deborah's practice continues unabated today at the age of 93. She is still working and has a lot to say about our work as well. Nanako and I met 40 years ago while students at the Cooper Union. She has a degree in urban design and landscape from Osaka University of Art. She studied with Kensaku Nakane, a renowned master of the Kyoto Gardens, and Tsunekata Naito, a disciple of Antonine Raymond. Aside from assisting in my mother's office early on, I had the privilege of studying with and working for John Haydock, Daniel Liebeskind, and Aldo Rossi, who I worked for twice, first as a student in 1979, and 6 years later in 1985, after completing a Rome Prize fellowship. In many respects, Rossi's practice, which embrace not only architecture and urban design, but drawing, writing, and teaching is how we engage the discipline in our practice today. Like Rossi, and unlike most US architects, competitions are central to our practice. Competitions allow us the freedom to examine and to push the boundaries of our ongoing design research on public space, architecture, and the city. In that respect, one thing that social media and the ongoing crises of COVID and social justice brought home to us is that there's no such thing as a public in general. Rather, there are many publics, some in fact just coming into being, each with their own specific culture and interest. Indeed, a strong piece of architecture creates its own public. Think of the worldwide response to the fire at Notre Dame in Paris, or the movement to save the old Penn Station in New York. New architecture creates new publics. For us, the responsibility of the architect is not only to be responsive to the highest aspiration of these publics, but to actively address, through our art, the new publics on the horizon.
My name is Eric Logan. I'm a principal architect with CLB. We are a multidisciplinary design practice with interest in architecture, interior design, branding, the design of objects, and public art projects. Our practice is based in the inspired landscape of the Rocky Mountain West, and with more than 2 decades of experience since our founding in Jackson, Wyoming, our work has evolved, but the essentials remain unchanged. Our studios approach each project with strong leadership, collaboration, and diligence. Our rigorous adherence to process and dedication to our craft informs original design solutions that respond to a particular context and set of client aspirations. As a result, our projects are recognizable, they're thoughtfully executed, they're innovative and refined in their details. Each of our endeavors is guided by our firm's philosophy, inspired by place. Since its inception in 1992, the firm has grown to accommodate a team of 40 in 2 studios, led by myself and my partners, Kevin Burke and Andy Ankeny. My primary focus is to raise the level of discourse on design within the studios, so I generate a lot of design content, as well as play the role of editor with multiple teams in what is an informal and collaborative atmosphere in our office. Operating a design practice is difficult work, but the results are very gratifying, and I actually love what I do. It's important to recognize that none of what we produce is possible without the talent and dedication of our amazing team, and I don't take that for granted. We feel very fortunate to be living in and working from one of the most incredible landscapes on our planet, and at CLB, we don't take that for granted.
Welcome, everybody. Eric, Callie, Jesse, it's nice to see you again. It's a pleasure to be a part of Design Talks Now. I'm David Sokol. I'm moderating the discussion today, and we are convening on unusual circumstances. So I think maybe we could just talk a little bit about where we are right now, and also our relationship with public space right now. Our relationship with public space in the last few months has been a wild ride. At once feared and avoided, and now it is feared but also actively embraced, and it's a necessary medium for us to perform our civic and democratic duties. But rather than speak in such terms, I was wondering if we could all just talk about where we are right now and how we are feeling about the public spaces that are closest to us. I, for one, am on the northern edge of a village in the Hudson Valley called Red Hook. There have been Black Lives Matter protests down the street at our one traffic light, and it's an interesting time. There's a real desire to be part of that, and most everyone is wearing face masks. But I can feel torn, about how do I balance this impulse to be involved, but also take care of public health. So now I'm curious if we can all just talk a little bit about where we are right now. Kelly, can we start with you?
Sure. I'm in Chicago, largely staying at home, working virtually. I think that for me, social distancing has started to become a little synonymous with staying inside. And I think that's probably a similar experience for people in other larger cities. And I think the reason for that is it's become apparent that we just don't have enough social spaces or public spaces in these cities because when people are allowed to access them, they become very overcrowded. So I understand what you're talking about, David, with kind of your desire to go out and participate in these public events while also wanting to balance your health and following, public health guidelines. And I think that's definitely something a lot of people are torn between right now, particularly people in larger cities.
Jesse, how about you? Tell me where you are right now, because I have a feeling that density is an issue.
My partner and wife, Nanako, and I decided to stay on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, not to leave the city. Of course, we're still carrying on our office, but doing it all remotely through Zoom meetings, which hasn't been too bad. But the Upper West Side is kind of a bubble, I would say, in Manhattan. It's strangely peaceful. The encounters I have are actually very cordial on the street, kind of reminiscent of the days just after 9/11, where people are really, extra courteous, more talkative actually than ever. Although, of course, everybody is keeping their social distance, but nevertheless, there's a sense of, I don't know, a kind of a strange solidarity in the neighborhood. Speaking to the shopkeepers and buying things and neighbors and so forth. So it hasn't been too bad. I mean, we were sort of proud that we didn't, flee the metropolis and we stayed here. But yeah, I mean, it's taken some getting used to, I would say.
Eric, how about yourself?
I am coming to you live from our offices in Jackson, Wyoming. This is a small community in the provinces, I suppose, a very different kind of practice here. Also have offices in Bozeman, Montana, so another Western outpost. 90% of us are back in the office as of perhaps 3 weeks ago, with new protocols, especially with respect to who's coming in from the outside and how many are occupying conference rooms, etc. Lots of reminders and signage and tape on the floors to behave ourselves and wash our hands. Up until, I suppose, the end of May, we were feeling, I guess, really two things. One, fortunate to be out here where we're surrounded by a lot of open space, fewer people here. Our numbers, infection numbers here locally were high on a percentage basis. We have a lot of tourism here, and there was a kind of an early outbreak, but fortunately, I think the numbers rose to only 100 in our community, with 99 recovered. Regarding the feeling of detachment, although there were protests and gatherings in our little town square, and those continue in light of all that's happening in the world, many of the younger people in our office who came to us from other urban areas, frankly, struggling with the kind of detached feeling, and a lot of conversation in the studio as a result of that, to try to help people, these younger people, understand that just because we're remote and it's not happening in as much in our backyard, that we're still thinking about it, we're still concerned, and we're still trying to respect each other and the sort of protocols that are important for all of us right now. When the national parks opened, Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks opened, I think it was June 1st. Because people aren't flying, all of America, it seems, descended on our little community, while our local community, I think, is being very respectful. Everyone masked, and lots of signage, and lots of, I think, the same kind of atmosphere that Jesse described a moment ago on the streets. For the most part, it seems that that contingent of America that has descended, perhaps oblivious to what's going on. There are no masks. There were early photographs when the national parks opened of people sort of cheek to jowl in front of Old Faithful unmasked. And so I don't know that we understand yet the ramifications of all this influx in our little community, but we're doing our best to remain sort of vigilant with the protocols that we're all trying to keep on top of these days.
Is your natural impulse to go back to the old way? Do you find yourself constantly sort of monitoring yourself, slapping your wrist because it's like, oh, I can't get closer? You know, is that your natural inclination, or has this happened so much? You now have so much practice in social distancing that it almost feels like you've become habituated to a new way of moving through the world.
For me, I suppose an older dog at almost 53, not completely through the relearning process yet. I think there are impulses, in particular in the creative meetings that we try to get together here in the office. It's much more difficult on the creative side of things, sitting across the table and drawing and talking and seeing eye contact, kicking each other under the table, all that sort of stuff. Very important to the creative stuff that we make. So that piece in particular has been very difficult to relearn. And I guess getting people back in the office, we're starting to make inroads there and improve our process. But we're frankly struggling with the creative end of things. I think the management of the people in the projects is still quite doable long term. There are people who are very productive at home, but there is a gap in our process because we can't be quite as dense and close when we're trying to be creative.
But I just want to focus on one thing that you said, Eric, about being an older dog. So Callie, I think you're the youngest dog in today's conversation. How do you relate to what Eric is saying about learning, relearning?
I feel like the biggest loss I felt during this process is losing that studio culture, design meetings, interactions that we all value so much in our profession. I have to remind myself that I need to be careful and stay distant. My impulse is to kind of go back to the way things were before.
I mean, I've had to modify the way I communicate on Zoom. Everything has now gone into Post-it notes, little sketch Post-it notes that I shove in front of the camera to communicate the ideas, efficiently as possible.
I want to acknowledge I'm going to jump back to Eric for a second, because I want to acknowledge the drawings posted behind him, and that is your design pavilion. What actually drove you to take part in a completely different fabric of public space?
When I put myself in the context of a place like Manhattan, I've got Times Square, I've got Central Park. There is an acute lack of available public space that will support the kind of population numbers in many of these urban centers. And that drives people beyond urban boundaries into state parks and national parks. Visitation numbers have increased over the past 15 years in those parks, and the budgets haven't increased, and so there are infrastructure problems there. Part of our culture here in the mountains is that we enjoy this access to that 97% of protected lands. And so I think of open space and public space for all of us as these wonderful national parks that surround our community. The whole idea that policy decisions made by non-designers can actually reduce some of those protections and take those away from all of us are disturbing. I think there is this notion that we need to be better stewards of our lands and our public spaces, do more to protect them, and find ways to create more of them. As it relates to what's on the wall behind me, when we received the invite, we jumped at it. I think the idea here that that appears in these drawings, which we hope will be realized in October, is a bit of this notion of a moment with nature in what is an incredibly vibrant and very urban environment in Times Square.
It sounds like you're also just proposing that there be a dialogue, that a person who uses one kind of public space also needs access to other kinds of public space in order to have a balanced life. Callie, in the Momentary, there's an array of public spaces, both indoor and outdoor, and it seems like that the planning for that space takes that very dialogue to heart.
Right, I think that's true. People use public space to gather. They use it to find a place of respite or escape. They use it to exercise. They use it to, consume art or other offerings. So I think that is something that we did try to integrate into the design of the Momentary as much as possible. There's a variety of scales of open space that are meant to hopefully foster different types of activities. By giving people multiple options, you increase their desire to kind of come in and use those spaces.
So can we talk a little bit about the Music Center?
Sure.
I'm curious, this project does have multiple, it isn't just a single public space. I mean, the building, the main icon of this project is a form of public space, and it's surrounded by public spaces. Could you walk us through the partie?
The idea behind it, which came from kind of the Taiwanese federal government, was to create a district in Taipei almost themed to their pop music industry. They had a lot of producers and performers in Taipei, and the government, because they perceived the growth of K-pop and pop from China and Japan, that they wanted to highlight this group and to actually make it a visible part of the city.
What exactly is the industry?
Taiwanese popular music, like the full gamut of the different types of Taiwanese music. But the center was really both to perform, but also to create new bands and roll them out and create a culture around the music industry. The idea of the government was very different from when we started dealing directly with the music industry itself. And of course, yeah, we also had a certain ethos about the project being not only about the music industry, but that it would be integrated into the life of everyday people in the city, that there would be a daily component to the project that would serve both the people that live there, but also all of the visitors and the music industry, all of these different groups. We had really, I loved the idea. It was a robot theater that moved and actually created different scales of performance in front of the stage, a stage that moved, and then fully public space behind it, park, would sort of follow in the wake of a moving stage and audience. That and a performance hall that was as hybrid. And when the music industry came in, they scrapped our main hall. They thought it was not big enough. So they went from 3,500 seats to 5,000 seats. And actually acoustics completely changed as well. They weren't interested in the live acoustics. They're actually interested in recording in the hall.
How did that affect your handling of the larger site?
Well, we kept most of the big ideas, in terms of the location of elements. There are two sites, actually. One kind of a large square site where the main hall building is, and then a very long site, which was where the public outdoor performances would be held.
Callie or Eric, have you ever experienced this extreme shift, this new player on the client side and kind of having to scrap some of your ideas in order to accommodate a new reality?
I'm still early in my career, but I've experienced that a couple of times already. I feel like it's probably pretty common. It's so important to have every stakeholder to buy in so early in the process to try to avoid that. But when new people are brought in, I think it's almost unavoidable.
I think we don't do a lot of competition work in this office, but the couple that we have done when we prevailed, for better or worse, I'm going to put it out there. I think you do what you think you need to do to win the competition, and then the process really begins with the stakeholders once you're in the room and at the table. So the start over thing that Jesse talked about a minute ago is very familiar to me.
I think we all kind of accept as a truth, that public space should be integrated, but maybe this truth is not self-evident. Is this something clients you actually have to bring them around to? What is that like for people who are actually, writing the checks for these projects?
It's the real politics of architecture, I think, and that rhetoric is so important for the architect. You understand, which stakeholder and which audience you're presenting to, and you have a very different narrative in order to, convince the client or the stakeholder that it's, good for them.
I think it's similar to like environmental sustainability. You have 3 pillars of sustainability: environmental, economic, and social. And I think that environmental sustainability has been pushed a lot. There's a lot of pressure on owners and developers to kind of follow those guidelines because we've been educated now on how important that is for our future. And I think social sustainability is something that, we have to push and put pressure on in a similar way, because I think it's equally important for people to have kind of that understanding of how important that is for the future.
It's very interesting too, because, I guess with sustainability, it's more quantitative typically, but then the social side is much harder to
Right.
quantify that way. And so it's harder for the number crunchers to understand the benefits. So it becomes a challenge that way.
We do a lot of residential design here, and we tend to talk about public and private space, even within the context of a home. And quite often because we're trying to connect people with place, quite often there's a notion about a shared, let's call it a courtyard or some common space that everybody in the house gets to share. Even that, which I think makes for a good house, in particular in an environment where you can get out and see and do all these great things. But for a residential client, that's kind of mind-blowing to think that they need a courtyard, for instance, and that's going to make a better house. But then it comes down to the sales pitch that Jesse's talking about and who's at the table.
I was curious what Callie's observation about social sustainability. The word sustainability was just like inherently a long-term durable word. How do you reconcile that with something that is inherently temporary, like this pavilion that's going to come up in October?
The event itself will be a moment in time, but there's a whole community component to this the making of this thing, the creation of this thing, that draws in this particular instance, 2 different studios here in the West, our structural engineer that's in Colorado, a client who's actually the fabricator for and investor in this particular project, who's in the middle of this state, another collaborator that's in Nelson, British Columbia, all of these kind of creatives that have come together. It's a filter for the city. It's this little veil of these kind of steel fins that capture this little organic moment. It's sort of blossomed, if you will, in Times Square and back to community. The tree is supposed to be repurposed someplace in New York City. There's a contractor who's helping us, who's based in Brooklyn. I think of this kind of sustainability notion in reaching out here in the West and connecting with other resources on the East. It also will have a life after the event in Times Square. It will come back to Wyoming, and it's going to live in a public park that is being developed by the client who's actually making the thing with us. So there'll be this kind of continuity of the story of blossoming in the West, moving to the East for a week and a half, and then it will come back to a permanent home where the community of Sheridan, Wyoming will be able to enjoy it.
Part of designing a socially sustainable space is trying to understand what people need, where they are, and then providing a space that promotes well-being. And I really feel like I got that from the brief about the pavilion. It's kind of providing this moment of rest and inward focus, a little break from everyday life. And I thought that was a nice concept.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's supposed to be a kind of a hopeful thing. And we hope that it will happen in October. And I mean, without hope, there is only despair, and then there's no action. And we all need to try and be nice to one another and respect each other and hope for better days here. We can't give up.
Mm-hmm. I also love what you're saying, that it's not just about the product itself. It's not just about end users and their relationship to the product, that there are opportunities to exercise sustainability, economic, social, or environmental, at every stage of the project's life cycle. It is kind of like what we talk about with environmental sustainability, about our supply chains, about the locality of our sources, and what happens potentially with either the waste stream or after disassembly. So to apply that same kind of life cycle thinking to another prong of the sustainability concept is really interesting for me to chew on right now.
It's also interesting, I mean, with the pavilions, there's a whole history of pavilions that were intended to be temporary. but they were so popular that they remained or got rebuilt. I mean, of course, the Barcelona Pavilion is a great example of that, but also San Francisco, bits of World's Fair buildings that were meant to last only a few months are still there. A pavilion becomes a kind of provocation for the future. I think it's a beautiful project too. I was looking at it, yours.
Thanks. Let's hope that it happens.
Callie, I'm wondering if you could kind of describe the different stakeholders with the Momentary. Yes, of course, it's an extension or an outpost of Crystal Bridges, but Crystal Bridges isn't the only player here. The Walton Family Foundation is also a part. The Bentonville community.
Yeah, I should disclose also before I start that I'm actually from Arkansas, so I was kind of a quasi-local that went to school in a town really close to Bentonville. So I did kind of come into the project with some understanding of the community there. I think it's about meeting with different groups to kind of understand what they want out of the project and then figuring out a way to kind of weave all of those together into something that feels cohesive. So, the Crystal Bridges Museum was very clear that they wanted a project that was a kind of a satellite of their museum, but very different from them in every way. The brief was to create a space that was for contemporary art, but was the opposite of a traditional art museum experience. So that I felt like was a pretty straightforward brief, but trying to figure out what that means and how to kind of design that space took some time. And we did spend a lot of time with, the Family Foundation, the city, different government officials, and Crystal Bridges to try to figure out what that meant for the community.
Was the craft plant already part of the brief?
I found the building kind of simultaneously with coming up with the concept for the space.
Were you asked, or did you decide to have some kind of dialogue with the Softy building? Did you feel like you had to have a language that was very overtly of adaptive reuse as a counterpoint to a new icon? Or did the Craft Factory have its own kind of iconic value that you could just amplify?
I think that the difference or the departure from the Softy language was kind of inherent in just the context and the existing building that we were given to work with. Crystal Bridges is located in the forest. You have to drive through the forest and you kind of descend to this holler and you kind of the building is revealed to you through the trees. The Momentary, the former Crafts building, is located in a more industrial part of town. It feels much more urban, and you're dealing with this existing structure that was built in the 1940s originally and added on to several times. So we didn't really explore the opportunity of trying to have a connection, a design language connection with the Softy building. It was just kind of inherently different from the beginning.
But part of the strength of that project is that you take the attitude that you embrace your condition, and that's the point of beginning for the project. It's not a clean slate thing, or it's not a try to change the form or structure of what's there to make it something it wasn't. There's an authenticity about it for that reason.
The project that resulted is very, very specific to that specific site.
I'm curious about the Bentonville experience because it's had this design renaissance in part thanks to the Walton Family Foundation. It has this new wave of tourism. Is the Momentary sort of part of a series of experiences that a visitor is having over the course of 3 days?
From the start, this is a satellite facility for Crystal Bridges. So you're always kind of thinking about how someone would experience both of those experiences, maybe one after the other or at two different times. And their opening exhibit at the Momentary was actually a shared exhibition, State of the Art 2, which was on display at both Crystal Bridges Museum and the Momentary. But we also wanted to create something that was for the local community, and the Momentary has no permanent collection. That's kind of inherent in the name. It's every experience is momentary and always changing. So we wanted a space where people could feel like they wanted to continually come back to and revisit because they're constantly getting a new experience every time they go. It's a place you can kind of start to integrate into your everyday life if you're a local.
Jesse, you talked about the initial concept of the project, its two sites being really firmly interwoven into the daily life of people. Did that actually manifest?
It did, actually. Well, I mean, I should say that it was a kind of site somewhat peripheral to the center of Taipei. So it was mainly an industrial area between a rail yard and the river. And then there were a whole series of low-rise industrial buildings. What you do find there, which you don't find in many other places, is being in very close proximity to undisturbed nature. So, I mean, there's a gorgeous kind of verdant landscape of hills and valleys that these industrial zones were built into very kind of fast and dirty after the war. So we were really responding to that. So it's like the choice in the context of what to respond to also, not to, in a way, be democratic about all of the things being important, but to try to kind of identify what was, you know, most powerful in the site and kind of respond to that. And it was really interesting that it actually, our proposal then changed the way the city chose to develop the rest of the site. They decided to develop in a way very similar to the way our complex was developed. So honestly, we were very selective about how to respond.
Is it fair for me to say that in the same way that Callie is thinking about the relationship between the Momentary and Crystal Bridges, your Crystal Bridges, as it were, was the nature on the edge of the city?
Yeah, there are no suburbs in Taipei. You know, the city and the way people live, it extends out into almost undisturbed nature. But then you get, you know, these old industrial areas surrounded by, you know, just phenomenally beautiful hills, verdant hills, and then, you know, rusting paint factories. Yeah, there was an overall move, I think, by the government to, you know, take down a lot of what was quickly built in Taipei and to, you know, kind of bring the quality back, you know, to the city.
It sounds like maybe in the case of Taipei, there was a desire for the center to have an iconic quality, which it obviously does. Eric, I will jump to you. There's no need to draw people. It's Times Square, right? I mean, they're just people flowing by all the time, but you still have some kind of urge to draw people in so that they don't just walk by. And Callie, this is not to say that, you know, an existing facility, you know, somehow disqualified from this conversation. I mean, the way that you handle it, the way that you interpret it, the way that you illuminate it, you know, I mean, these are all the same considerations as if you were designing from scratch. So the question, I guess, is for all of you is how important is an iconic value as a means of drawing attention? And then the corollary question is, then how do you keep people's attention?
I'll go first. With this, the thing on the wall behind me for Times Square, I mean, I think given that context, one has to make a decision if you're going to sort of hang on to the edge and be part of, populate that edge condition and leave the middle to be the middle, or in this case, and to the question of iconography and I guess object buildings, that seemed for this project to be the best response. It is supposed to be this little message about hope and this moment to interact with something organic in this crazy urban context. We really thought more appropriate to make it iconic, make it a draw. Then there is an experience that one has with the object when one is on its perimeter, and there are sort of views through and around. There is a bit of enclosure. It's intended to be a little bit of a filter between what's in there and what's going on in the city. The kind of transformation from its original concept, where it was very opaque, and I think interactions with Eileen and some other stakeholders had us open the thing up for security reasons. I think it's a better project for that, and certainly works better in the COVID environment that we're in. But other than that, I mean, there is a bit of art for art's sake with this one. I mean, we're trying to make something beautiful, and that feeds back into the whole iconography statement at the beginning of this.
I think that Eric's project and the Momentary are kind of on opposite ends of that spectrum, where you have the Momentary of more of kind of an infrastructure that allows these pop-up temporary experiences to happen. And Eric is designing one of those experiences in a different location. And I think Jesse's project in Taipei is maybe kind of a little bit of both. Part of it is very focused on temporary events that bring people there for specific purposes, but then you also are creating somewhat of an icon for the community. So I think that, there's kind of both ends. It's providing a space for these things to happen and then actually providing the thing like Eric is talking about that might be a little bit more of an icon in itself.
I think that's true. And it's interesting, too, that it begins to expand our notion of what the iconic can mean, because Eric's, in an interesting way, is a quiet icon. I think very smartly, they didn't try to kind of outdo the neon and the lights, but it's a place of rest and centeredness and a place to escape from, which is very appreciated by people who live in New York. And and yours is, I guess it wouldn't fit into the same kind of realm of the iconic, that it isn't kind of so much about the shape of the building or its appearance, but how it hosts the events within it.
I think that's right. It's how it hosts events and also visual art installations and letting those kind of take center stage.
Right.
Well, and Jesse, we're talking about public space here, but your project is so beautiful and there's so much form making going on there. I would love to hear more about that part of it.
Well, there's a ritual aspect to the entire center, which is connected to the way they kind of confer awards and kind of elevate people to the Hall of Fame. So it goes back to some very traditional ways of kind of organizing space and icons. So it was one of these things where we didn't want to over-determine how the forms of those buildings would be understood symbolically. Actually, the music industry people assigned their own meanings to the forms. Even though the forms are very definite and connect mainly to the functions, we pulled back when it came to actually kind of ascribing a significance to those things.
Programming spaces, activating spaces. I'm curious in your practices, where do you draw the line? Eric saying just a tree, or Callie's referring to the momentary as a social infrastructure that gets activated by others. But is there a point where you say, okay, I have to stop now because I can't be overly prescriptive, so that people have the license to interpret and to activate as they see fit? Is that an internal dialogue you have with yourselves as you're making these projects?
Whether at the scale of a restaurant or a sort of urban planning problem, I think it is important to not overthink it. If the space is there, whatever people are doing in the space at the time makes it relevant, whether it's a protest or a birthday party, whatever it is, that it's sort of the moment. If we think of public spaces as sort of an armature for human performance, that's enough. We'll figure it out. We're adaptable.
I was thinking a lot about protests in LA, like shutting off the 405 or the 101. If the public space isn't there or doesn't necessarily accommodate the public's need at that moment, the public will find a space, which doesn't necessarily invalidate the need to integrate public spaces into these projects.
We really have absolutely no control over who the tenants will be, who will occupy the spaces around the plaza. We were also actually trying to come up with a way of giving them license to just go crazy with signage and with all of the things that happen in the city organically, figuring out zones where they would be totally free to kind of work bottom up, and then other areas where I guess the taste of the architect constrains that kind of growth. But it was a lot of fun actually trying to figure out how to kind of work with that. We'll see what happens, because I don't know what will happen actually.
I was just going to say, Jesse, that's an interesting idea about zoning, especially with a development as large as your project, kind of specifically zoning different areas to avoid it all just feeling a little too homogenous and letting people kind of make their mark and maybe in the process take ownership of the space too.
we were thinking about, instead of trying to be ad hoc formally, just create a zone where, they can go to town, do whatever they want in there, and it'll be much better than anything we could do, to make it look that way. It'll actually be that way.
And I also imagine that license, providing license is, allowing for expression, democratic expression with the lowercase d's, also happens to be more deferential as we are thinking about incorporating or elevating disenfranchised communities, communities of color, people who don't normally get to come to the table during, decision making about where capital goes or, what sites we procure.
Well, I think the idea of public space and maybe not having enough of it is particularly relevant, given that access to public spaces is especially limited to communities of color or low income groups, and thinking about how to ensure that we're always bringing everyone to the table as much as possible in the design of these public spaces, and creating spaces that are welcoming to everyone, I think is more important than ever.
Jesse, when we talk about engagement and bringing people to the table, how complicated does that become in another country?
You're dealing with groups with very different ideas. So in a way, there isn't a unified sense from the Taiwan side of what the place should be. And there's actually it's a very young and active democracy. So people get up and pound the table and make their voices heard in a way even more than, at least up until recently, you would find in the U.S. We had many meetings with different groups, community groups, the city, the cultural bureau, the music industry, the local developers. It was a very interesting experience to kind of work, coming up with having that design and having it approved by the international jury, then, presenting it again to each of the stakeholders and getting their reactions to it, and how we would, in ways we could modify the project.
Something we always talk about at Wheeler Kearns is that any proposal is a monologue and a design project is a dialogue, and you're going to come up with different results just based on that difference of how kind of the process is different. So it's inevitable, I think.
How much do you have to lead a client or any stakeholder, to the idea that public spaces are vital?
As with anything else, people come to the idea of wanting to build something for different reasons, but I do think it's our responsibility as designers to educate people on the importance of that, if that's not one of their top priorities coming in.
I agree with that. I mean, it's you get very sophisticated, very knowledgeable, very driven clients who have a direction that they're interested in, and that's where the conversation starts. There are other clients that really don't know and are looking to be led, and there's always, I think, on the responsible designer's side of it, a bit of playing the role of good shepherd and really dragging your clients, whether they're very sophisticated or not, through some kind of rigorous process that will result in a predictable outcome. And that at the end of the day, that's supposed to be a good project. Whatever that means and whatever the context of that project, a good project is what we're hoping for.
We have this movement to an online life. Commerce is online and protest takes place online. This 25-year-old dialogue, was founded on a premise that the internet would kill public space, that the migration and everything online just not only invalidated it, but just rendered it all obsolete. And that's not really the case. It's a much more complicated reality.
Yeah, I think our digital lives, they are one aspect of our lives, but it will never negate the need for a social space and public space. And I mean, I feel like just that everyone's experience, or at least my experience in the pandemic, has made that more evident than ever, that social interaction is important, and being completely virtual, completely digital is maybe works for a short time, but it's not long-term sustainable. for me.
I'm perhaps showing my age, but I think that this whole architecture and public space thing is experiential. It's tactile. It's much more than just the visual thing you get digitally. I still find it bizarre to give awards to architectural projects that are only concepts that are developed in the computer. That's not a building. Getting a building built, creating a physical thing is very difficult. It shouldn't be. I guess, as difficult as it seems to be. But the proof is in the actual artifact, I think. And I'm personally less interested in digital fantasy, although we use computers and they're powerful and useful. I don't trust robots. Maybe that's part of my problem with my age. But I need to touch and feel it to know that it's real.
There have been so many discussions about COVID is changing the way education buildings or campuses are being designed. Perhaps there's a new wave of, suburbanization or migration to exurbs because of this. Are there permanent implications?
Well, it's a density problem, I think, right? Hopefully it's temporary. But the question becomes how many humans you can fit into whether it's a house or an auditorium. We just have less capacity, I suppose, and therefore less of an audience. And if you're working for a developer, I mean, lots of questions about the developer or restaurant owner. There's a pro forma that relies on an occupancy with their wallets out, right? That churns the economy. I don't think we know yet the implications of this dip. We're going to have to rethink how we plan spaces so that we can be further apart from one another. If this is a permanent thing, let's hope it's not.
But I think if anything, we've learned that spaces have to be adaptable and flexible, because this is hopefully a temporary situation with social distancing, but for a space to be really sustainable long term, it has to kind of incorporate some kind of flexibility and adaptability to respond to different situations that are going to arise and seem to be arising more and more frequently.
These 3 projects today all are classified as cultural commissions. Is the opportunity to integrate public spaces unique to the cultural type? Is there a unique obligation to consider the public in works like this? Or is this more of a universal criterion for any kind of design project?
I think it's more universal. I mean, Eric was talking earlier about some of these principles being incorporated even into a single family residence. I think, corporate or office buildings, it's very important to design around spaces that are the social centers and where people kind of cross paths and gather. And Jesse, I know your project does incorporate some commercial aspects, different tenants and things. So my sense is that it's kind of a universal truth, but it might be the way we're talking about today is more specific to how it gets integrated into a cultural project.
I think one of the things that became very clear to us that there isn't one unified public, even in specifically related to that center, that you have a very specialized public who are interested, say, in a certain genre of music coming one night to this center and occupying all of its public spaces. But in the morning, you'll have residents who, may be totally indifferent to music at all. And so we felt it was our job to keep those urban spaces open, that they're vessels for a lot of different publics, and to negotiate with the stakeholders, and even to kind of design spaces that were more permeable and less monofunctional to, say, just performance or, just shopping, but that the two could actually work together, and it was really be based upon even what time of day you're talking about.
I feel like everyone's comments kind of put to bed, the notion of the caped architect who comes in knowing better than everyone else. it seems, we this era of listening and collaboration, creating license for a whole diversity of human experience and interpretation, not only guarantees the longevity of a project, but hopefully allows more people to access it and to feel like they've been seen.
I think with all of these things that we're classifying as public space, a bit like Jesse's attitude about the venues they created in their project, the public space becomes this kind of armature for performance, and that is human interaction. I think that's what makes it relevant.
I think that's true. I think a public space is a space where a lot of different aspects of your everyday life can overlap or happen. Like you work, you socialize, you see and be seen, you can learn, consume art or food. I think that that's what makes a public space a space where people want to spend time.
Thank you, everyone. I'm so glad that we got to have this conversation. I enjoyed this journey today.
Thank you, David. Thanks, Jesse and Callie.
Thank you, David, Eric, Jesse, and Callie. And thank you all for joining us. Agreed. We desperately need public space as focal points to strengthen community. Next week, Design Talks Now welcomes Norway to the discussion with an international perspective. So until then, please continue to stay safe, stay smart. Design stands together. And I hope to see you soon in Times Square.